So we have a fantastic panel to kick off this workshop today, really to help us set the stage for where we are now and where we are going with representatives from NIH, from FDA, as well as from PCORI, and I'm pleased to introduce them now. Joining us is Eliseo Perez Stable, who is the director of the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities at the National Institutes of Health. Richarde Araujo, the Associate Commissioner for Minority Health and the Director of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and Megan O'Boyle, who's the Principal Investigator and the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Data Network at PCORI. And you can refer again to their full bios in the speaker and briefing book. But welcome to each of you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Well, why don't we go ahead and begin? And in fact, Eliseo, you can stay off of mute because I'll turn the first question to you. Obviously, in your purview and role at NIH, you've been quite involved in working toward greater person-centeredness across the entire medical research continuum and ecosystem. As you think about where we are today and where we should go in 10 years, I would love for you just to reflect a bit on that question and that evolution with this greater attention to how we bring in more diverse communities. Where are we and where do we need to go in the next 5-10 years?
Well, thanks for the introduction, Esther, and I'll say a couple of things. First, I'm a general internist by background training and a primary care doctor before I got to NIH. So patient-centeredness is all about the clinical work I did for 37 years. So I very much embrace that concept. I do think that applying it to clinical trials and to clinical research in general, it takes some extra effort. And I think the aspect of being engaged with a community as well as with the individuals needs to be attended to. I'll say a couple of things on the inclusiveness part. We have a society that is approaching or over 40% non-white right now. The United States has evolved, and our clinical workforce and our clinical enterprise has lagged behind. And I think this is a priority. Second, community engagement methods for research and for long-term connection with different communities works. I think we have enough evidence, enough experience that this approach and method is effective at being able to reach our diverse communities. And we should incorporate this in the clinical trials enterprise. Third, having a diverse sample in a clinical research trial is good science. There are questions that will be left unanswered if we stay with the easiest to recruit participants in a clinical study, in a clinical research trial. And then the last point I'll make there is that there are conditions where we see disproportionate effect among certain populations. Rare diseases, of course, you go after the patients with the rare disease. COVID-19, we see that 50% of cases are happening with African American and Latino individuals. So I think it makes sense that the clinical trials be overpopulated by these two populations, because that's where the diseases are happening. And you can see diabetes and other conditions that have similar or disproportionate burden. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
You know, that was a very helpful overview. I would love to dive into some of those questions as we continue the conversation. I'm going to go over to you, Richarde, to talk a little bit from your vantage point at FDA. Maybe two questions for you just to kick this off. The first is, can you describe a little bit more for those in our audience that are not familiar with the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity? What do you do at FDA? And then the second thing, which many people want to know, is if we want more representative and inclusive clinical trials, why can't FDA just mandate that? What are the restrictions? What's the environment that you're operating under?
Sure. Thank you, Esther, and good afternoon. I should say good morning, almost afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you today. So a little bit about the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at FDA. We are an office that works to protect and promote the health of racial and ethnic minority, underrepresented and underserved populations by really focusing our efforts on research and outreach and communication that works towards addressing health disparities. Our ultimate goal is, of course, to strengthen all of FDA's work and respond to minority health concerns. Our office sits within the Office of the Commissioner. We work broadly across the agency as well as with a broad range of stakeholders. And I mentioned that we focus our efforts into areas, of course, research. We have a research program that aims to advance minority health and health equity focused research. We do this through supporting both intramural as well as extramural research. We have our outreach and communication program that works to improve FDA's communications with the populations that we serve through a variety of different culturally and linguistically competent strategies, tools, programs, and initiatives and campaigns. Probably one of our most notable campaigns is our Diversity in Clinical Trials initiative, because that is, of course, a key priority area for our office, and we are always working to advance this initiative and adding new tools and resources. So to get to your question about, when we think about inclusivity and what is FDA doing in that space, and I guess I'll speak to it specifically from our current authorities. We have long worked to advance diverse participation in clinical trials, inclusivity in clinical trials, from hosting public meetings, developing tools, and issuing guidance documents. One guidance document that I did want to highlight that we recently issued is the Enhancing Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations Eligibility Criteria, Enrollment Practices, and Trial Designs. And this was a guidance that recently came out in November 2020. And it highlights and talks about ways that we can broaden eligibility criteria through inclusive trial practices, trial designs, and various different methodological approaches. Talks about how sponsors can increase enrollment of underrepresented populations in their trials to improve trial recruitment so that we can get to the fact of where our enrollment in trials reflects those that are ultimately going to use the product. It also talks about broadening eligibility criteria and encouraging recruitment for clinical trials of investigational drugs intended to treat rare diseases. So we have, of course, long worked to advance diversity in clinical trials under our current authorities with issuing guidance documents like the one that I just mentioned. There are a range of other guidance documents that we've also issued, as well as a lot of work that we've been doing across the agency from a patient engagement perspective as well as patient-focused drug development. So when we talk about ways that FDA works to encourage and advance diversity, we do that through our authorities and through our guidance documents that highlight our expectations, like the one that I just highlighted and mentioned. And the one thing that I'll also mention is that back in 2012, under the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, there was a lot of work that went into looking at our regulations. And what was found from that initial report that came out back in 2014 is that our current regulations support and inclusive trials that are submitted to the agency. And there's a lot of work that's been ongoing since FDASIA, from drug trial snapshots, which is transparency effort and provides information about those that have participated in clinical trials that supported FDA approval of these drugs as well. So I'll pause there.
Okay, now very helpful. Can you paint a little bit more of a picture for us? Where do we stand in terms of the data on diversity in clinical trials? As you just mentioned, it's been a long priority and focus of your office. Where are we? What does that data look like?
So some of the data that I can share today is taken from our Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Drug Trial Snapshots program that I just mentioned. They recently released a 5-year report. That 5-year report highlights data from 2015 through 2019 from approved NMEs. And when we look at that data as far as racial and ethnic minority representation, it's really what we expected to see based on the annual reports that come out for the individual calendar year. So there's also a yearly summary report that comes out from CEDAR as well. And from the report, the 5-year data that just came out, that database had about just under 300,000 participants. Of that data, and this is of course combined U.S. as well as outside of U.S., there were 76% representation from whites, 11% representation Asian, 7% Black or African American, and about 1% American Indian or Alaska Native, and then about 5% other. But when we look at that, and it was also presented within the 5-year report from a U.S. perspective, we see that of about 102,000, a little over that, 102,000 U.S. participants, there were about 16% representation for Black or African Americans, about 2% Asian, about 1% American Indian or Alaska Native, and about 15% Hispanic or Latino. So that 5-year report gives a lot of data. I'm only highlighting just a couple areas from that, but there's a lot of data, including breaking it down by therapeutic areas as well. But we really saw what we expected to see based off the yearly summary report as well.
Very helpful. Thank you so much, Richardae. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of your thoughts around practices that you would like to see going forward. Megan, why don't we come to you? You've long advocated for the patient's role in designing and even in executing clinical trials, just being brought along in the entire end-to-end from design, recruitment, enrollment, et cetera. Can you describe from your experiences, where are we today and what do you envision we should be in 5 years and 10 years in the great work that you've been doing at PCORI? And you're on mute, just a note.
It's only been 11 months. Thank you for having me. And just to go back a bit, I actually was an awardee of a PCORI award that ended in a few years ago. But it was a great experience for 5 years, and I was the PI. So obviously PCORI is definitely stepping out of everybody's comfort zone by allowing patients without research or scientific background to be PIs. I obviously had co-PIs and we learned a lot. But I just want to step backwards and say, I came into this space of rare disease because my daughter, who's now 20, has a rare syndrome, genetic syndrome. And I was recruited 10 years ago to help build a patient registry. At the time, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what a PI was, and I certainly did not know what an IRB was. And I was recruited because I lived closer to NIH, and that's all our organization could afford in terms of travel expenses. As time went by and I learned from all these incredible rare diseases, and I started to hear about patient-centric and patient-centered and patients first, I became incredibly confused. I was raised by an oncologist, one of the first in the District of Columbia. And although I rarely saw him, he saw his patients around the clock. And in our house, patients were centered. And when I started to go to these meetings, I thought, well, if they're not the center, who is? So first I had to catch up and understand why the patient had not been the center and who exactly was, and why there was such resistance by researchers and industry and even sometimes clinicians about listening to the patient. So as I learned more and heard more, I became a lot more passionate. And as I learned about things like OHRP and IRBs and the fear that researchers live in of those things, I realized that there were barriers that existed that shouldn't. And to me, frankly, a lot of this is common sense. And perhaps that's because I don't have any initials beside my name and I am not responsible for a lab of people. But I feel that so much of what is being done now, whether it's in research or clinical trials, is old. It's not 2021. It is not the metadata that we're living in. We are being protected by IRBs of things that we don't necessarily want to be protected of. We are forced to sign consents that don't allow us to share identified data because people think that we need that protection. Meanwhile, we're sharing our data with Netflix and CVS, and everybody's got my GPS, and my insurance company probably knows when I drive through McDonald's. So it doesn't make sense to me that our health and our lives are being hindered by this fear of privacy and security, not even that we're consulted with. And in the meantime, in the 99% of the rest of our lives, we're giving away our data left and right and don't seem to have concerns. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to rant a little bit more later.
So can you tell us a little bit more even about your experiences as a PI? When we talk about wanting patients to be at the center, what does that practically mean? And what do you think the implications are for various stakeholders, for the researchers, for the patients themselves? How do we get more deeply embedded into the community?
I can actually better speak to this as a parent of a child that was in a clinical trial 2 summers ago, before COVID. And we were very excited. It was a very small trial. We volunteered for it. And I also am the PI of the registry, so we had provided data to the researcher in advance, and I knew them very well. When I asked, our organization had to ask to see the protocol, which we were allowed to do, and we made some suggestions. We then asked to see the schedule of the day, which we were allowed to do, but all of this was post-IRB acceptance. And I made a lot of points that, there's no way my kid's going to be able to do this before lunch, or if you make them do it after lunch, they're going to vomit, or, why aren't you building in any time for walking around? And also, it was really expensive to get there. How are you going to repay the patients? So since then, we have been approached by some other groups, and I found the biotechs to be very open to us reviewing protocols and schedules, but it needs to happen before they've gotten their approval. And we need to look at the consent. And, we now take red pens to consents and say, this isn't necessary, this is too scary, this is redundant. And when you have people that don't have time to take a shower, you cannot present them with a 20-page informed consent and expect that they're going to read it. They're going to do what they do with their online apps, and they're going to flip to the end and hit agree. That is not informed. So if people truly want informed consent, they need to make it short, concise, honest, but stop writing it for the lawyers and out of fear. And I think the patients need to see that the patient groups need to see the consents prior to IRB approval.
Good points. Eliseo, I'd love for you to react to a few of the points that Megan brought up in terms of when is the right point of time to engage the patients. And you've run community-based participatory research programs. What are your learnings from that? And how do we expand, from these stories that we hear from parents into what becomes normal practice?
Well, I think everything that Megan said resonates with all of us who have been clinically engaged and active, whether we've done research or not. The patient is at the center of our concerns in clinical service. And so in clinical research, I concur completely that should be also a priority. And unfortunately, it frequently hasn't been in the past. I think hopefully that is evolving with clinical trials, particularly for rare diseases or uncommon diseases. I think understanding what the population one is targeting to recruit is just crucial. And before you design the trial, or as you design the trial, as you develop the procedures and the consent form, engaging an active advocate for patients, if not patients themselves, I think makes perfect sense. Now, it could have been so common sense, as pointed out, that scientists or methodologists were not thinking of it, but I think we should know. We should definitely know better now. I have to say also that this informed consent of 20 pages and people just flipping through it and agreeing is just too common. Imagine if you don't speak English. Imagine if it's written at a 12th grade level and the average reading level is 8th grade in the population. So it's even more barriers. And we saw that frequently at the Cancer Center with trials. We're saying, well, how can we get more diverse participants in our clinical trials? Well, one reason was you didn't have the approach that would even begin to get at it. And so there have been an effort to try and simplify the main points in communicating what one is consenting to. But I'm delighted to hear the comments coming from an advocate, a patient advocate, about don't write this for the lawyers as much as you have to write this for the patient. And I think that we have to figure out how to thread that needle better. So I agree.
Yeah. And Richarde, we've gone through this COVID experience. We're still in the midst of it. Certainly, I recall early on as the clinical trials for the Pfizer vaccine and Moderna vaccine were getting enrolled, really an outcry from the community to make sure those trials were reflective of the populations for which were more affected from the disease. And we saw that concerted effort. You referenced the guidance document that FDA had put together and is available. Are there best practices from your perspective that emerged from the experience of watching the enrollment into those clinical trials in this year and prior year, and what you had envisioned that to be coming out of the guidance?
I think that one of the things that COVID-19 has done for us that, in thinking about prior to a pandemic, is that one of those barriers that we hear all the time is that people know that there are clinical trials out there for them to participate in. So with COVID-19, everyone, the public was aware that there were these trials and that volunteers were needed. There was also a heightened awareness of the fact that COVID-19, of course, proportionally impacts racial and ethnic minority communities, and that we needed that diverse participation in those trials. So one of the things through COVID is that there was just that heightened awareness of the importance of this and the need for this. And I think that what we've also seen from that is that renewed momentum for work that I know LSAO and Megan and all of us have talked about, needing that diverse representation in those trials. Some of the things that we know that have worked and continue to work as far as strategies for us to have a more inclusive trial. We talked about making sure that we have patients engaged, patient advocacy groups engaged. Megan talked about that, making sure that these trials are less burdensome. And thinking about trial design, logistics, recruitment, and retention practices. Of course, also the consistent, continued bi-directional community engagement. I think that was very clear with COVID-19, that we have to make sure that we engage the community, not just kind of, stepping in and telling them what we needed to tell them, but really making sure that we understood what that community needed to know with regard to participation in clinical trials. And there are a range of efforts that were ongoing, from engaging with cultural ambassadors, faith-based organizations, trusted leaders in the community. And those are efforts that were even in place, and have continued prior to COVID-19. I think the other part, and LSAO mentioned this, when we talk about how do we overcome barriers, how do we think about those strategies and best practices, we have to really work to also eliminate those language barriers, making sure that there is information available in multiple languages, making sure that someone that is engaged understand that there's a priority and there's an importance and focus for ensuring that we have diverse representation in that trial all the way through the site. So there are a number of things that I think we have learned from COVID-19, that we are continuously learning from COVID-19. There's a lot of work that's also been going for many, many years as far as overcoming barriers to clinical trials. And I think we saw that really highlighted within COVID-19, and how when we really put a focus on ensuring that we have inclusive trials, that we can achieve having inclusive trials with having the attention and focus planning early on, recognizing that community engagement is important, recognizing that sites that are able to successfully enroll diverse populations are very important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's also this point about making the trials more user-friendly, which will encourage participation within diverse communities, but really to make it a much more a friendly and relevant experience, I would say, for patients participating or people participating in clinical trials. Megan, just coming to that point, one of the challenges that we hear all the time, if you slow down to include patients in the design of a clinical trial, if you slow down to get that diverse participation, the trials become more expensive. How would you as a parent or as an advocate respond to absolutely want to hear the voice of the patient, but what about the downstream considerations about the expense that may potentially be added on to clinical trials if you do so?
It's interesting. I asked for years, why is the patient not being consulted? Like, why are we the bad guys? Are we the crazy moms that nobody wants to talk to? And it took years before somebody was honest and said, it slows things down. To have something slowed down, it means something was already in motion. And that means it was started without the patient. So therein lies the problem. Prior to the design of possibly the drug, the patient community should be engaged. What is it that they're living with that they don't want to live with? What is their quality of life issues? Maybe you're developing a drug for something that is number 5 on my list of things that make my day miserable, or my child. So I think prior to, the drug development, during drug development, can these kids handle needles? Are they able to swallow? What about the kids on G tubes? So I think that frankly, the excuse of it slowing things down is a reflection of the group's fault of not including them from the very beginning. And I think that's, I also think that not retaining patients and not recruiting the full amount is also a way to slow things down and lose money. And if you don't design it with the patients and families in mind, then you are not going to retain them. And never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that there would be drug trials that were failed to recruit. And the longer I'm in this space, I realize that even happens in rare disease. And it's because that the patient voice was not considered from the first step.
And to that point, Eliseo, are there best practices that are emerging? You're doing work across cardiovascular diseases, diabetes. These are chronic ongoing conditions. To Megan's point, we do also increase costs when we don't fully enroll in these trials. What's emerging? What are the kinds of best practices, tools, resources that we can start to point different stakeholders to?
So first, I should, as a disclaimer, say that NIMHD doesn't really fund big drug clinical trials at all because we're a small institute, but we have a lot of experience in reaching out to diverse communities and my own personal research career worked in Latino, African American, Asian American communities extensively in a variety of research contexts. You mentioned the vaccine trials, and I had the opportunity to sit for probably about 10 different meetings with Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, the Operation Warp Speed leadership, Moncef Slaoui, the Surgeon General, and the Moderna CEO and their medical leadership team, and help them at least get more activated about how to reach diverse communities. You're right, Megan, they did not plan it to begin with. They set up a website and said, come and join our trial. And of course, certain communities were a little slower getting to that website. You could register and even if you registered, they weren't being reached out to. We were able to nudge them a little bit. They understood the importance of it. And they ended up with about 20% Latino and 11% African American, which I'd say was respectable, better than Pfizer, better than the other companies have done so far. They did slow down. They paused recruitment of white participants at one point in order to get to a better target. And the whole point is saying, here's a target that we should try and achieve. Let's, from the beginning, aim for that target. How are we going to get there? We need community engagement, trusted messengers. We need maybe some more personal time with the experts. Maybe Dr. Fauci and Dr. Adams needed to reach out to those CROs that were recruiting in those cities that were more heavily minority in order to maximize their zeal, their motivation to do this. And we also had to dispel this myth that, minorities aren't interested in clinical trials. They're worried about the conspiracy. The government's out to get them. And I heard that from people who were out there trying to recruit. They immediately got turned off thinking, there's this, and independent of the issue of literacy and language and approach, this personable approach. Everyone assumes, if I can only get the ministers or the priests to support it, then we'll get the minorities on board. Or if we can get the celebrity, the African American celebrity or athlete to endorse this, then we'll do it. It's really the most powerful message comes from your local nurse, your local doctor, your local leader, who can then speak in plain language and role model as to why these things are important. And I don't want to also forget that when we don't have diverse participants in studies, not perhaps in vaccine studies, but in many drug studies, we're leaving science, we're leaving discovery on the table. There are things that we will not learn if we don't have, I don't want to say representative sample, because that's really hard to ask investigators to do that every study, but some diversity in your study so that you can learn about what might be an important mechanism that we previously weren't aware of. That was what was happening 40 years ago when all the clinical trials were in men. And we didn't realize that women and heart disease were different than men and heart disease in terms of how we treated them. So I think it's the same path, and we're making gradual progress, but we've got a ways to go.
And you talked about the fact that the best messenger, Eliseo, are those in the community that can speak with plain language. We tend to chronically underfund outreach within communities in education around things like clinical trials. Is that the right strategy? Should there be an education component around what are clinical trials? How do you access clinical trials that are relevant to you? And how do we embed clinical trials, as we talked about early on, in community-based hospital settings? As you know, a lot of the trials happen in academic research institutions that are far away from where diverse communities are in their local community. How do we start to make this shift towards what we saw as a necessity through COVID, but we want to become standard practice?
I think we're at an inflection point where hopefully industry understands that this is worth investing in. I think academic institutions have gradually moved in that direction. If you compare the CoVPN network that the NIH set up for recruiting for vaccine trials to what the companies were doing, you can see a contrast in the investment in both the community engagement effort to begin with, getting experts to help, developing culturally tailored messages. Not everything was perfect, mind you. I mean, nobody has exact science on how to do this, but you have to invest in people and effort to say, how do you get this message to these different communities and in order to engage them? And the results were clear. CoVPN networks were better at recruiting diverse participants in these trials than the CROs put up by the pharmaceutical companies, whether it was Moderna or Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca, the three that I had opportunity to see. The NIH did respond with something called the Community Engagement Alliance Against COVID-19 in response to this crisis for the vaccine trials to do precisely what you said, invest in communication messages, to gather trusted messengers that are both on a national level. We can always get Dr. Fauci to say something great if we can get him, but we really need local people to be able to represent this, as well as other NIH leaders, academic leaders, and to be able to go out there and talk to the community. Now, in response to the crisis, we have been able to stand up this program, but the principle of it is community engagement. We are in the community, we listen to the community, we don't do things and then react. We actually partner with the community fully from the beginning and then deliver the message or develop the message to be delivered together. And we'll see. We're not quite 5 months into it, so it's been a bit intense. But we're pivoting more towards vaccine uptake because that's really what we need to get our populations to begin to do. At the same time, that continue to deal with the mistrust and misinformation that has unfortunately been disseminated so broadly.
Mm-hmm. And, Richarde, as we come to a close here, I'm going to ask you and Megan to reflect as well on where we should go. And for you in particular, what do you think is the role of FDA for this vision we're talking about, hopefully earlier than 10 years, but toward 10 years of a more person-centered and inclusive clinical trials enterprise? How can FDA help?
So I think one of the things, of course, is that we want to continue our efforts to reduce the burden, making sure that we are broadening eligibility criteria, making it easier from what we've talked about today for participants to participate in clinical trials so the trials can be more inclusive. And of course, we know that means absolutely engaging with patients, engaging with patient advocacy organizations, just like we've talked about today. I think the other part is that, coming from the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity and everything that Eliseo just highlighted as far as consistent, continued bidirectional community engagement, all of the work that we know can help to overcome barriers to have an inclusive trials and racial and ethnic minority participation in trials, that those efforts continue, that we have we've been talking about this, as we all know, for many, many years, but that there is a focused and that there are organizational goals that are committed to that so that we can continue to advance those efforts. I think the other thing is that, of course, with COVID-19, we've learned so much in our virtual environment. So I'm sure that we, even coming out of this, are going to be thinking about things as far as technologies, tools, and techniques, real-world data, and a number of other advancements that can continue to help us as far as we're thinking about the next decade and farther.
Very helpful. And Megan, just to come to you to round it out, and there are questions coming in through our Slack channel and Q&A box. So hopefully we can get responses there over further communication today and the workshop. But Megan, as we come to you, it may be stunning for people to think about, particularly those in the general audience, that our clinical trial enterprise is where we're having this conversation, right, about how do you make sure that the patients are at the center. It sounds as though that should have already been the case. As you look across your experience and work, what's the wish list that you would have going out 5-10 years? What changes would we want to see?
So again, we're going to go backwards and get genetic testing referred. I live in the world of rare disease, and rare disease is often where treatments for common diseases happen. And I will tell you, there's absolutely, positively no diversity in most of the rare diseases I see, unless it's a disease that's specific to an ethnic or racial group. And how do you have diversity when you have 99% of the population is, not an underserved population? So one, the medical community has got to get their heads around getting people referred for genetic testing. And the second thing is these communities, whether they're common or rare, need to be educated in what I said, learning to speak up about the protocols and the consents and the schedules, not to tell researchers and industry how to do their jobs at all, but to help them do them better so that they can retain. And the other thing is, this message can't come from research and industry because it's going to look like they are self-serving. The patient community needs to get fired up by someone, and I'm not volunteering, to point out the time and the lives and the money that is wasted by this overprotection of IRBs and by this lack of inclusion of patients in studies. But I really, going back to the whole, consents and IRBs and that has to come from the patients. I mean, researchers would look like monsters if they complained and said, you got to lighten up on us. So we need to think whether it's the umbrella organizations like Faster Cures and Global Genes, or whether it's other lobbying groups that can get patients organized, because patients are busy and they've got other things to do. So I think that from a disparity standpoint, though, the genetic testing is one of the big things.
Well, thank you all very much for thought-provoking comments. This was really meant to kick off a lot of the work that will happen throughout the course of the day in our breakouts and further speakers that we will have. But Eliseo, Richarde, Megan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing your perspective. There are many more questions that are coming in. We wish we had more time to dive into them, but really appreciate you offering a very good perspective. I know we didn't have a chance to talk about the workforce and the diverse workforce, but that also plays a significant role. I think as we go forward, our goal really is how do we outline actionable next steps across various stakeholders and sectors. But thank you for the terrific work that you're doing from your respective vantage points. So I'll let you all go for now, but thank you.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you.